20 minutes this evening, but this evening, over the last few months, we've heard much about the savage cuts that Conservative governments are making to public services across Australia. We've heard how necessary it is for Campbell Newman to cut 14,000 jobs from the Queensland public sector. Necessary, they are his words, including almost 3,000 jobs from health services. We've heard how tough it is for Barry O'Farrell to rip $1.3 billion out of education in the state of New South Wales. And in an extraordinary display, I think, of one-upmanship, we have heard Isabel Redmond muse that she might cut up to 35,000 jobs from the South Australian public sector. And the story, it seems, right across the country is the same. Liberal governments are slashing jobs and slashing community services. They say they need to cut spending, but what they are really cutting is investment in our children's future. They are cutting investment in the high-skilled workforce of tomorrow. They are cutting investment in communities' health, in our workplaces' productivity, and I think they're cutting investment in what is today crucial for growth and in savings for tomorrow. These cuts shore up future losses in exchange for what are illusory, completely illusory short-term savings. And in my own home state of Western Australia, we are suffering too, as the Liberal government is cutting into essential services like policing and health in an attempt to paper over their own financial mismanagement. Western Australia is not immune to the Liberal obsession with public sector cuts. Nowhere is immune. And there will be worse to come, I think, under an Abbott government. But hopefully, and I will be fighting with tooth and nail to make sure that we do not live to see that day. While the Queensland and New South Wales governments have recklessly cut funding in large, sweeping blows, the situation in WA, I think, has been death by 1,000 cuts. They've made smaller but far more numerous cuts to the public sector over the last 4 years. The WA Liberals have peeled back funding for community services like health, and they have done this by stealth. It might be easier for the WA government to get away with, but it isn't any easier for Western Australia's police or for our hospitals. Not for our police stations, for our nurses, our doctors, and for them to keep delivering the health and community services that we so very much rely on. So just a few weeks ago, WA Liberal Treasurer Troy Buswell, he announced a $330 million cut to public services. And these are on top of the 2% so-called efficiency dividends that the Liberals are trying to bleed out of our government departments. What I find most incredible is that the first areas that the WA Liberals seem to look for are in vital services like health and community safety. In $330 million worth of cuts, it includes $10 million from the WA police budget, in addition to the $21 million efficiency dividend that the police have already been expected to pay. That's $31 million that will no longer be available to the Police Commissioner, reducing the ability to keep frontline officers on the beat and Western Australian communities safe. I know in an effort to head off this criticism, Mr Buswell ruled out Queensland-style job cuts when he announced these cuts. Yet the WA Police Commissioner has already confirmed that 104 positions will have to be, for want of a better word, cancelled or lost from WA policing in order to achieve these cuts. And as a result of these losses, according to the Commissioner, there will obviously be a reduction in the quality of services. WA Liberals simply have their heads in the sand if they think that slashing the police budgets, the police force's budget, will not have an effect on police jobs and the services that they deliver, not have an effect on the number of police officers or on them being where they're needed when they're needed. And in the Department of Health, the situation is the same. Officials estimate that 130 positions will be lost as the Liberals rip $12 million out of the health services budget. And that move has provoked outrage from not only the unions in Western Australia who work in the health services sector, but also from the Australian Medical Association. They have rightly pointed out that Western Australia can't afford a reduction in the quality of its health services with a population that is booming and also ageing. And in fact, in the news this week, we've seen that Western Australia is behind other states in important things like emergency service waiting times. But the Western Australian Liberals appear to be unmoved. And I can only conclude from this that they just don't care about the quality of services available to West Australians. They simply don't care. But Mr Buswell, he has refused point blank to rule out further cuts. That on its own is, I think, unacceptable. But what is even more outrageous, because it's the Liberals' financial mismanagement that has created this need for these cuts. There's no doubt that WA Liberal government has a problem with revenue that they are busily trying to paper over. The budget papers have consistently forecast a drop in the Australian dollar, even though all other forecasts tell us it's going to stay at around its current level. And that has had massive ongoing impact on WA's bottom line. And that is the one thing that the WA Liberals still refuse to acknowledge in their budget papers. They, in their budget papers, have the Australian dollar tracking, I don't know, it was about 76 cents, when we all know it's up around on par with the US dollar. That has a substantial impact on forecasts on real revenue that we get from things like mining royalties. So they are simply papering over the real state of the budget. Rather than planning for this fall in revenue and saving appropriately, actually working through an intelligent process as we've been trying to do in the federal government, the WA Liberals have been busily splashing money on pet projects. Pet projects like Colin Barnett's lavish new offices and the Perth waterfront development. They've left people in Perth suburbs adrift, I think, facing soaring electricity prices thanks to the Barnett State Government, thanks to the Barnett State Government soaring water and gas bills, without any compensation, as we did through the carbon pollution reduction scheme, or in any compensation in relation to being able to access quality local services. The West Australian Liberals have abandoned things like the much-needed train line to Ellenbrook, and they are also very busily privatising services at the new Fiona Stanley Hospital. They've also put forward that the Swan Districts Hospital, the new Swan Hospital, should also be a private model. These are things that I object to. But the savings they have made by breaking election promises and outsourcing public services have quickly been eaten up by spending on themselves and their boutique projects. That is because the WA Liberals are focused on governing, I think, for a privileged few rather than for all Western Australians. At the same time, they run the risk of putting the WA budget into deficit. They have, I say, their priorities wrong. and the people of Western Australia are paying the price. I suppose while the financial mismanagement and skewed priorities in WA is horrifying, I fear that it is nothing compared to what would happen under a potential Abbott federal government. Indeed, the federal coalition has responded with nothing but applause for the public service cuts carried out by their state colleagues. In fact, Shadow Treasurer Joe Hockey seems to believe that Campbell Newman hasn't gone far enough in throwing 14,000 Queenslanders out of work, wishing all strength to his right arm. We have good reason then, I think, that the federal coalition will brutally slash community services. But just how far would they go? Coalition MPs have promised to deliver Australia back into a $15 billion surplus. I think this is a staggeringly unrealistic surplus in the wake of the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression. A $15 billion surplus is roughly equivalent to the savings that could be made by, I don't know, abolishing Medicare. Are the coalition really prepared to cut that deep? Are they? Let's not forget that to even get to the point of delivering that surplus, Tony Abbott has to first find $70 billion worth of savings.
I remind you to call Mr Abbott by his name.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. You are indeed right to draw my attention to needing to refer to Mr Abbott by his correct title. That Mr Abbott has to find some $70 billion worth of savings to fill that black hole in his budget. And just like his state Liberal colleagues, that black hole exists in Mr Abbott's budget not because the world faces the biggest financial crisis in our lifetime, but because the coalition has made reckless, unfunded promises to the electorate. That irresponsibility, that planned financial mismanagement will force them to cut jobs and services if they are elected. And so the coalition must explain which services it will cut to deliver its budget surplus. Will it be Medicare? Will it be schools funding? Will it be infrastructure? Australian families deserve to know where the coalition will get its $70 billion worth of savings from so they can know just how much and Mr Abbott's government would cost them. The massive cuts to education, to health and community safety that we have seen under state Liberal governments are, I think, just a warm-up act for what Australia would see under a Mr Abbott government. Labor, on the other hand, will move to protect jobs and services. We know that budgets sometimes take hard decisions, and we've made many of those hard decisions. But there is a very clear difference between the way Labor and Liberal governments approach these decisions, and that is because there is a very clear difference in values between Labor and those on the other side of the chamber. Labor values a fair go for all Australians, including those doing it tough. Labor values a strong community and the services that support it. So if you want to know what those opposite value, just take a look at what their state colleagues choose to cut and choose to fund. Nurses and police officers gone to pay for fancy offices for Liberal premiers. This Labor government has made hard decisions, but we have found efficiencies rather than cut services. Finance Minister Penny Wong only recently said that she and Special Minister of State Gary Gray had found new savings in the public service of $550 million over the forward estimates by doing things like reducing allowances, travel and external consultants. Similarly, the WA Labor opposition have announced their plan to increase secure employment in the WA public service and cut recruitment costs. The plan will also make, I think, public service jobs more attractive, helping recruit and retain higher quality, more experienced public servants. That in turn will boost public service productivity and create savings. So Labor's plan to show how savings should be made in government by becoming more efficient. In contrast, the coalition at both state and federal levels is simply focused on slashing jobs and vital community services. We are a government focused on delivering in accordance with Labor values. This means making sure that people get the support that they need when they need it. It also means that when Labor puts together a budget, we do it with fairness and with the well-being of local communities in mind, making hard decisions like funding the trial phase of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Labor is putting the budget back into surplus, but we're not going to do it at the expense of people with disabilities. To Premiers Newman, O'Farrell and Barnett, who've complained how tough public service cuts were to make, I say this: no matter how tough these cuts were for you, they will make life much more tougher for millions of ordinary Australians. Every dollar ripped out of our schools is a dollar ripped from the future of young Australians. Every dollar ripped out of our hospitals is a dollar ripped out of a person's life when their life hangs in the balance. And every dollar ripped out of infrastructure is a dollar ripped out of a more competitive and sustainable economy. So I am proud to be a member of a federal Labor government that stands against these kinds of cuts to jobs and community services. I'm proud to come from a state where the Labor opposition has a plan to keep our public services strong. And I'm proud to say that I will fight every day alongside my Labor colleagues to make sure that the people of Western Australia have the quality public services that they need and deserve.